Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to leaders past and present. The intention of the Honouring Australian Writers series is to pay tribute to writers who have made a significant contribution to our literary culture, and it's an opportunity to perhaps discover for the first time or revisit these great works that may have been overlooked or perhaps undervalued. We're very grateful to the State Library and Samantha Hagan and her team for providing the venue for today, and also to the Copyright Agency Cultural Fund, which has not only funded today's event, but they've provided ongoing funding so that we're able to establish this as an ongoing program, which I think is particularly important if you're talking about honouring Australian writers, because there are a lot of them who deserve the opportunity to be returned to. Last year we began the series with Thea Astley, and today we turn our attention to the West Australian author and poet Randolph Stow. The timing of the event has coincided very fortuitously with Text Publishing reprinting 5 of Stow's works, and all of them have been introduced by contemporary Australian authors. So Gabrielle Carey is has written one of the introductions. Bernadette Brennan, Drusilla Majeska, and Michelle de Kretzer, who are all also with us today. So very honoured to have that collection of writers. Those books are all on sale in the library, along with in the library bookstore, which is just out past the cafe, along with other of Stow's work and also works by some of the panellists here today. There's particular people that I'd like to thank: Professor Dennis Haskell from the University of Western Australia, and Helen MacArthur, who's Stow's sister and the executor of his estate, and who's unable to be here today. She lives a very long way in Western Australia. But we do have the great pleasure of having Genevieve MacArthur with us, who is Helen's daughter and Randolph Stow's niece. So before I introduce the panel, I'd like to introduce Genevieve MacArthur, who's going to speak on behalf of the family. And it's very, very special that we're able to have a representative from Randolph Stow's family with us today. Genevieve, thank you.
So my name is Genevieve MacArthur, and I'm an Associate Professor at Macquarie University here in Sydney. But more importantly to this audience, I am the daughter of Randolph Stow's sister, Helen Stow, who later became Helen MacArthur. This makes me Randolph Stow's niece and makes Randolph Stow my uncle. However, Randolph Stow is not my Uncle Randolph, he is my Uncle Mick. Some of you may wonder how a name like Randolph could possibly translate into Mick. In fact, my uncle's name is even more complicated than that. His official name is Julian Randolph Stow, but my grandparents thought that this didn't sound quite right for a baby, so for reasons beyond anyone's comprehension, they nicknamed him Mickey. As he got older, this transformed into Mick, and when he moved to Harwich in the UK, Mick got transformed into Michael because they already had a Mick in his favourite local pub. To complicate things further, Uncle Mick didn't like the name Julian, so he ignored it entirely. So Julian Randolph Stow ended up as Randolph Stow, and Randolph ended up as Michael or Mick, depending on whether or not you lived in Harwich. When Julia from the New South Wales Writers' Centre asked me to say a few words about Uncle Mick on behalf of the family, I struggled to think of what to present. I thought perhaps I could tell you a few anecdotes about Uncle Mick that might demonstrate the dignity, intelligence and kindness that he displayed to me as my uncle. However, some of those characteristics have already been beautifully described in Gabrielle Carey's book, Moving Among Strangers, which won her the Prime Minister's Literary Award and, for what it's worth, the gratitude and respect from Randolph Stow's family. And we hope that some of these characteristics will come shining through Suzanne Faulkner's upcoming biography of Randolph Stow. Given that there are 2 recent works on Uncle Mick's character in life, I thought I would instead offer an anecdote about his character in death. In around 2001, I met up with Uncle Mick in London to have lunch in a small Italian restaurant near the National Gallery. Halfway through the meal, after a characteristic characteristically lengthy silence, he announced with considerable and uncharacteristic glee that he had just arranged to be buried in a cardboard box. After I had finished choking on my pizza, I asked for some clarification. With a twinkle in his eye, he explained that he had just paid for a woodland burial, which meant that he would be buried in a cardboard box, and they would plant a tree on top of him. His body would fertilise the tree, which would be one of many trees used to reforest a derelict field. Around 10 years later, Uncle Mick died quite suddenly of liver cancer. My mother managed to get to Harwich in time to care for him for a short while before he passed away, and my father managed to join my mother in time for the funeral. However, it was all too sudden for me to get to the UK in time to say goodbye. So just 2 weeks ago, my partner and I went to visit Uncle Mick and his tree in the forest. We stayed overnight in one of his favourite pubs in Harwich, the Alma, where we were told that the local elders still speak of him. The lady proprietress also told us about the time that a young Australian had come into the pub and asked the entire bar if they knew where Randolph Stow was. They all denied seeing him, even though he was sitting quietly in the corner drinking his pint. Then we went to Uncle Mick's forest. It is in the most beautiful area. My father gave me a mud map to help find the tree, which we did, as you can see in the pictures behind me. The tree is doing very well, and the wooden plaque that marks the tree is still just readable. I tied some gum leaves to the tree to remind Uncle Mick, well, at least to remind his tree, of Australia. I think the idea of using one's own body to fertilise a tree to help grow a new forest is dignified, intelligent and kind, which is how I remember my Uncle Mick, aka Randolph Stow. I would like to finish by conveying a message to you from my mother, who lives in Perth and so could not be here today. She wishes me to tell you that she is enormously pleased with the appreciation that Uncle Mick's work is getting now, as demonstrated by the text classic editions, the Fremantle Press poetry selection, the Weekend Australian Essay and Review, Gabrielle's lovely book, Suzanne's biography to come, and the interest in making a film of Tourmaline. And she would like to thank each and every one of you who have made the effort to come to this event today to keep the memory and works of Randolph Stow, aka Uncle Mick, alive. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Genevieve. That was very special to hear that personal connection to him and to hear of your family's relationship with Uncle Mick. Yes. So to the discussion. I'd like to introduce you to the panel that we have today. We're very lucky to not only have a collection of writers in their own right, but people who have written about him, have had personal connections with Stow, have made a documentary of Stow, working on his biography. So it's quite an impressive panel of people. We'll begin. So each of the panellists will speak for 10 minutes, and then there will be a panel discussion, and there will also then be time at the end for your questions, so you can gather them up during the discussion. First, we have Suzanne Faulkner. Suzanne, as Genevieve mentioned, is in the final stages. Well, it's off at the editing stage. Hopefully your stage is complete. Putting together her biography, Mick, A Life of Randolph Stow, which will be published by the University of Western Australia early next year. Suzanne is the author of 12 books of fiction and non-fiction. Her most recent books include The Imago, E.L. Grant Watson and Australia, and Mrs. Mort's Madness. She's been shortlisted in the Vogel Award, the Queensland Premier's Literary Award, and the New South Wales History Awards. After Suzanne, we have Richard Tipping. Richard is a poet and visual artist. He has published 5 books of poetry and held over 20 solo exhibitions of textual objects in Australia, Europe and the USA. His art poem signs are available in gallery shops internationally, including the Museum of Modern Art. In the 80s, he produced a series of video interviews with Australian writers, including Stow, David Malouf, Les Murray and Peter Porter, and we'll be seeing an excerpt of his Stow documentary today. Gabrielle Carey is an author, academic and memoirist. She started her career with the publication of Puberty Blues in 1979. She has since written In My Father's House, a biography of her father, and Waiting Room, a memoir of her mother. Her most recent book, Moving Among Strangers, is an exploration of her family's connection to Randolph Stow. It was the joint winner of the 2014 Prime Minister's Award for Non-Fiction and was shortlisted for the 2015 National Biography Award. We also have Alice Nelson, who's travelled all the way from Western Australia to be with us today. I'm really pleased that we're able to include a WA writer who has been not only a great fan, but her career has been influenced by Randolph Stow. Alice was named one of the Sydney Morning Herald's best young Australian novelists for her first novel, The Last Sky, which won the TAG Hungerford Award and was shortlisted for the Australian Vogel Literary Award and the Barbara Jeffress Award. She is also the author of the recently released After This, Survivors of the Holocaust Speak. Alice is currently completing her doctorate of philosophy at the University of Western Australia and is at work on a second novel. So now I'll hand you over to Suzanne, who will begin the individual talks.
One thing I've discovered over the past 3 years or so while I've been researching Randolph Stow's life is that the world is divided into two types of people: those who have no idea who Randolph Stow is and those who have a deep attachment to his work. It's not hard to guess which group has come here today, so I think we'd all like to thank you for that. It's hard to know what to tell you in 10 minutes about Mick Stow. My experience of living his life by proxy has been intense, but also hugely enjoyable. It's taken me to Geraldton and the Trobriand Islands, to Eastburg, Holt and Harwich, and finally to his burial place in the forest at Rabness in spring when the elderflower was out. What struck me in particular is the warmth and affection in which Mick was held, even by people who hadn't seen him since they were in primary school with him. For someone reputed to be a recluse, Mick had an extraordinary talent for friendship. He always had people who wanted to look out for him, from Peter Gall, his patrol officer in Port Moresby and the Trobriands, to his musical collaborator, Peter Maxwell Davies in London. Another thing he had, which is often overlooked, was an extraordinarily wry and scurrilous sense of humour. He also loved cats, flowers, books, poems, art, and pubs. However, he wasn't too keen on the idea of biography. He refused to review his friend Patrick White's memoir Flaws in the Glass, or his friend Jeff Dutton's autobiography Out in the Open for the Times Literary Supplement. And he turned down at least 3 people who wanted to write a biography while he was still alive. Nevertheless, if Stow was ambivalent about the idea of his own biography being written, he knew that one would be. I think one does need to know a great deal, well, a certain amount about an author's life, and not only what he chooses to have known, he told an interviewer in 1976, referring to Joseph Conrad, a writer with whom he felt a particular affinity. At the same time, in 1998, after writing a highly entertaining and astute review of Francis de Groen's biography of Xavier Herbert, whom he knew through Mary Durack, and whose work he in fact admired, he wrote to his friend Bill Grono, "What a ghastly, embarrassing old pillock." Well, you'll soon read my opinion of him. Stow finished the review with some thoughts of his own. As a person, he wrote, Herbert was such a depressing spectacle that, quote, academics must begin to ask themselves whether every writer must have a biography, whether the revelations do not detract from the work. In his later years, Mick's own desire for authorial invisibility and his gradual progression towards literary silence made for a chameleon-like camouflage in his personal life. One of his friends, who met him in Malta in 1963, wrote to me, "One further thing to say about Mick. I always had the feeling that he lived in a huge subterranean world, rich in treasure, into which others were not invited. He came out often, bearing gifts or maps or postcards, stories and fables, but that world was too precious and vulnerable to admit others. He kept it a deliberate mystery. For me and the simple peasants of Malta, that was a rare and valuable offering of friendship." We're lucky, therefore, that Mick wrote a great number of letters to several people in whom he confided vastly different perspectives on his life. Mary Stow received her first letter from her son when he went away to boarding school at 14. and the last one in about 1998, and she kept most of them. Over several decades, to Jeanne Jeffers, the French-speaking Belgian wife of his mentor, Professor Derry Jeffers, he wrote some of the things that he couldn't write to his mother. Bill Grono's uninhibited correspondence with Mick began when both were young poets in their early 20s and ended a few months before Mick's death. Unlike Patrick White, even as he became increasingly ill in the last years of his life, Mick did not ask any of these people to destroy his letters. Not long ago, another of my regular Stow correspondents, Ray Sinclair Wood, a retired schoolteacher and bushman from Quorn in South Australia, sent me a passage from a recent biography of Lewis Carroll. In this, the author, Robert Douglas Fairhurst, quotes the narrator of Flaubert's Parrot, who says, "Books say she did this because. Life says she did this. Books are where things are explained to you. Life is where things aren't. I'm not surprised some people prefer books." There are two questions that people have tended to ask about Randolph Stow, and I imagine Gabriel probably got the same thing. Why did he leave Australia? And why did he stop publishing books? Mick's progress from school to universities in Perth, Adelaide and Sydney was predictable enough. But then instead of going into academia or the law, he suddenly veered off to the Kimberley and then to Papua New Guinea. Further sojourns followed in Suffolk, Leeds, London, Scotland, Malta, New Mexico, Maine, Alaska and France, before he settled in East Anglia. All this time, at least in the earlier stages, he was writing his extraordinary poetry and a handful of brilliant novels. Stow's meanderings seemed sometimes purely impulsive. He changed his mind often, seemingly carelessly discarding opportunities, fellowships, commissions and offers of jobs, almost as if blown about by the wind. After returning from the Trobriand Islands, he gave up a writing scholarship to Stanford University in California in favour of travelling to London, with no particular plan beyond meeting his publisher, Jock Curl. Within a week of arriving, he'd applied for a teaching job in the Congo. And one wonders what he might have written if he'd succeeded in that. Periods spent teaching in Australia and England invariably gave way to a longing to live away from cities and academia. A stint learning Indonesian at Yale University in 1965 was supposed to lead to an academic job in Malaysia, but instead he escaped to Alaska, where he started writing about New Guinea. When Bill Grono showed him a paper in which he'd argued that Stow was one of that group of Australian writers, including Christina Stead, Henry Handel Richardson, Martin Boyd, even the ultra-nationalists such as Henry Lawson and Xavier Herbert, who felt impelled to escape Australia for more civilised countries, Mick responded dryly, "I didn't leave Australia for more civilisation, I left it for less." When Stow finally did settle permanently, it was in a part of England where he felt at home, close to the land of his ancestors, but it was also one where strangers were accepted without question. Stow once said that he felt he was an outsider among his own countrymen, a much more uncomfortable position than being an alien among other wayfarers and strangers. Sailors on land, in a place like the port of Old Harwich, you might say, are by definition only ever visiting. So it seems to me that you could answer these two questions in terms of literature, philosophy, psychology, or sometimes even medicine, and each answer would be partly true and none entirely true. We've all read biographies where a meaningful design has been imposed on a random scatter of events, but sometimes it's the biographer's meaningful pattern rather than the subject's. Sometimes it's from a desire to attract readers by scandalous revelation, or because the writer has too much trust in their own grasp of psychology, or has an agenda to redeem or condemn based on their own beliefs and prejudices. I believe that a biographer must therefore interrogate themselves as much as their subject. However, What I do think I've discovered about Randolph Stow over the last few years is that if you read his books carefully, and in the context of when and where and why they were written, you'll find that he generally answers these questions himself.
"30 years have passed since 1985, when I was living in England and making documentary films, including on Randolph Stow in East Anglia. Wishing I'd been a better friend and stayed more in touch, yet glad that I was able to make a film which I hope represents him properly and which I know he enjoyed. Glad that A Country of Islands was screened nationally on ABC television and widely distributed on VHS tape for 10 years afterwards by the Australian Film Institute. Now it needs to be digitally mastered and re-released just when the Australia Council's funding has been savaged. Today we're looking at two excerpts from A Country of Islands, which has been transferred to DVD for today thanks to Juliet Salas. It looks a bit fuzzy in low resolution compared to the original, but let's see. In the first clip, Stow talks about how he doesn't like the idea of writers talking at conferences and that works should speak for themselves. In the second, longer clip, he speaks about growing up in Geraldton, gives an overview on his career, and then reads the poem Wine. We'll see 6 minutes out of the film's 28.
I do sometimes have my doubts about the value of interviewing writers and asking them to conferences and asking them to address university students and so on, because it seems to me that writers are very often writers because they're not talkers. I'm certainly not a talker. My father was absolutely silent. That may be the reason. One hopes that what one puts into books is what is important, and that one says it there and says it better than one can face to face. I was born 50 years ago at the country town of Geraldton in Western Australia. It's a fishing and agricultural area, very small in those days. And it's the area where my mother's family were among the earliest settlers. They took up land there in about the 1850s. And as a child, I spent a lot of time on farms and stations. That was really the inspiration, if that's too important a word, but the beginning anyway of my early teenage novels. What I wanted to get down was partly old traditions of early life in the district, but most of all the landscape. The Merry-Go-Round in the Sea was a sort of attempt to make use of what was good, what was passable in the first two novels, so that I could then discern them, and they will never be seen in print again. I wanted to do again the landscape and the feeling of my own childhood. I'm asked if I've considered myself an outsider. In a way, I was born very much an insider, in that I was born into a large clan, country clan. Most people I knew, I suppose, were my cousins. I had an enormous number of cousins. So I suppose I was an insider in that group. I wasn't terribly interested in larger societies. Life for me was a country district without very many people in it. I was never too sure what I was going to be. It seemed that there were only two possibilities. Either one was to be a farmer, like my maternal grandfather, or else one was to be a lawyer, like my father. So when I was at secondary school, I kept my options open by doing both Latin in case I became a lawyer and agricultural science in case I became a farmer. And so I filled up the school timetable. In my youth, I was a sort of anthropologist, an apprentice anthropologist, really. Soon after I left university, I went to live among Aborigines in the far tropical north of Western Australia. And that country made a deep impression on those people, as must show from the novel I wrote about it, To the Islands. And as a result, I later went for a year to the University of Sydney to study anthropology and anthropological linguistics. Then I went to New Guinea, where I was attached to the government anthropologist as his assistant. And that was extremely interesting, involving living in Melanesian villages and getting about among the islands by small boat. But unfortunately, it wasn't a very healthy place, and I didn't take very good care of myself. And one of the reasons for my moving to Suffolk was convalescence. For the past 25 years, I've lived mostly in East Anglia. For some time, I went on writing about Western Australia and other places. My novel, Tormolan, for instance, was written in Yorkshire while I was a lecturer at the University of Leeds. And The Merry-Go-Round of the Sea was written in a ranch in New Mexico during the time when I was wandering around the States in the mid-60s. After doing The Merry-Go-Round, I felt that all that part of my life, the impressions of childhood and adolescence, had been used up, written out. So, day approaching, I sat down and decided that I had to live in one country instead of all over the place. And because of association and habit, I thought England was the only place I wanted to live. So I came back. I lived in London for a couple of years because I wanted the experience of knowing the big city. I went back to Suffolk, where I'd first settled in 1960. That year had been quite a productive one for me. I wrote a number of poems after a dry period in New Guinea. And I also took up botany and country winemaking and such things. And a poem which recalls that is one which I'm going to read now, called Wine, all about country wine in Suffolk. By the way, the expression malolactic ferment means something which happens to wine when the plant which produced it the previous year flowers in the next spring. The wine effervesces as if in sympathy. Wine. When among new leaves and tender tendrils the first green grape flowers appeared, wine rejoiced and the drunken casks danced in the cellars. A phenomenon known to Jack Reardon, Diploma of Enology, as the malolactic ferment. Now, far from those vineyards, gooseberries in bloom solicit by doorways, and last year's hysterical wine is bottled and drunk, all sparkling, by country wives. Children ride their bicycles to the meadow. They rejoice in the mayweed, the poppies, the rose bay and meadow sweet of the river. Under their heels, bruised coriander steams greenly to the sun. I rejoice in the spring. I strike the intolerable window. Another year, and the bubbles rise bitterly in my veins.
When Randolph Stow was suddenly gone in 2010, I thought of that marvellous and yet haunting image of the spinning merry-go-round, how time is tethered where its centre lies. I think that applies to us all. Stow's ability as a poet is held in this compact intensity of thought and association, often tied with the close tang of place. As he wrote in For One Dying, where all birds cease to sing and paths grow faint and melt into the hills, you pause, tasting the wind. Or again, his summoning of the Tao as the yielding darkness no matter can withstand. These are memorable words touching upon the mystical. But, as Gabrielle Carey notes at the end of her biographical article from 2010, My Mother and Mick, quoting from Tormolan, if we talk about it, we'll talk crap. This is one of the laws of the universe. And of course, this from somebody who actually wrote a great deal, even if they entered a kind of literary silence. I'd like to give some context for the film. How did this come about? To have Randolph Stow talk so fluently and to structure with him a visual telling which could reveal his character in situ in his adopted home. All this with a budget about 1/10 of the size of that for a standard television documentary. My background is both as a poet and documentary maker. In the early 80s, I tried to interest Film Australia in making documentaries about famous Australian poets and novelists, but was firmly told in a rejection letter, quote, "Writers are not a suitable subject for the film medium," unquote. Now, true, it's tough trying to hold audience interest with extended talking heads, but really? I decided to concentrate upon poets, and in 1984 applied to the Australia Council's Literary Arts Board to make a video documentary with Roland Robinson as a test, and then with Les Murray on pneumatic video, with a crew of 2 and a tiny budget. Poor Roland had to come down from Lake Macquarie and do his thing on the flat roof of my apartment in North Bondi, because there wasn't the budget to take the whole crew up to Belmont. Soon after, I moved with my little family to Italy to live in a visual arts board studio near Milan. When I heard that David Malouf was currently in his house in a Tuscan village, I made contact, applied for funding, found a film crew. The story of that filming, A Place in Tuscany, is recounted in his book 12 Edmonstone Street. In London, I was able to make a documentary with Peter Porter and to record interviews with Sumnerlock Elliott in New York, Jack Lindsay in Cambridge. A big thank you is due to Tom Shapcott and the Literary Arts Board of the time for their determination to see writers recorded. The archival film program from the Australia Council also made interviews with many writers who you can see listed there on the top left of the screen. Copies of all of these are held in this library on VHS and available for view, and they've promised to clean the heads and fix the tracking. Getting documentaries about writers onto Australian television wasn't easy at a time when no such programs were being made for or by Australian television. And this is an attack. Have a look at the film records of the ABC during the 1980s and into the 1990s. The cupboard is almost bare. Compared to this, living in England in the 80s was a treat. Literary culture constantly celebrated on television through writers' talk shows, long in-depth studies of particular writers, and yes, poetry readings. My plan with the Writers Talking series was to record archivally useful interviews, but also to have poems read directly to camera, so that the viewer was personally addressed, rather than using the standard 3/4 profile shot of the subject looking off screen. I joked that the series could have been called Writers Walking, as you've seen. With a lean budget, shooting on 16mm film for archival reasons, I was using an editing ratio of 3:1. That is very tight, bleeding the cutaways dry. For someone supposedly shy and reclusive, Mick in fact was charming, humorous, generous with his time, easy to work with, while being faced by a crew of 4 people and trying to act natural, while being directed. Yes, that's me with the 1980s shirt. I had read the 5 novels which text classics. Can we go back one now? I'd read the 5 novels which text classics has recently been published, and all of his poetry. We planned places and scenes in the golden glow of an Indian summer. Locations ranged from Constable Country to the wharves of Harwich Harbour, and from the marshy saltings of the Stow to his friend Charlie's brass-cluttered living room and his own tall and narrow house. When the first cut of the film was made, with the brilliant editor Steve Collins, I found that it was 5 minutes... Go back to the first one. It was 5 minutes short. Mick very kindly agreed to come to London to shoot a couple of new scenes, but he arrived looking completely dapper. Now I had to integrate Mick with his sailor's walk and country manners with this sophisticated-looking city man. The double image of Randolph Stow strengthens the portrait in A Country of Islands. We're now going to hear Stow read the poem Ruins of Hay. John Kinsella notes in his book Spatial Relations that in this poem, I quote, "There's an often tormented recounting of a failed Edenic vision, the Western myth examined through displacement via the geography, religion and arts of classical antiquity is left denuded in the face of the desires of a new agriculture imposed on an ancient land. Well, that's the critique. Let's hear the poem.
Ruins of the city of Hay. The wind has scattered my city to the sheep. Capeweed and lovely lupins choke the street where the wind wanders in great gaunt chimneys of hay, and straws cry out like keyholes. Our yellow Petra of the fields, alas. I walk the ruins of Forum and Capitol through quiet squares by the temples of tranquility. Wisps of the metropolis brush my hair. I become invisible in tears. This was no ratbag's Eden. These were true haystacks. Golden but functional, our mansions sprang from dreams of architects in love. Oh, my meadow queen. No need for fires to be lit on the yellow hearthstones. Our walls were warmer than flesh, more sure than igloos. On winter nights we squatted naked as Eskimo, chanting our sagas of innocent chauvinism. In the street, no vehicle passed. No telephone, doorbell, or till was heard in the canyons of hay. No stir, no sound, but the sickle and the loom, and the comments of emus begging by kitchen doors in the moonlike silence of morning. Though the neighbor states, said Lao Tzu, lie in sight of the city, and their cocks wake and their watchdogs warn the inhabitants, the men of the city of Hay will never go there, all the days of their lives. But the wind of the world descended on lovely Petra, and the spires of the towers and the statues and belfries fell. The bones of my brothers broke in the breaking columns. The bones of my sisters, clasping their broken children, cracked on the hearthstones under the roof trees of hay. I alone mourn in the temples by broken altars barred in black nightshade and mauve Salvation Jane. And the cocks of the neighbor nations scratch in the straw, and their dogs rejoice in the bones of all my brethren.
Thank you.
His voice is so beautiful, and it's, just creates some sort of magic atmosphere. I don't know. I'm still under his spell after all these years, and it was at his memorial event in 2010, just after he died. That was the first occasion that I heard his voice, and that was the moment I just fell in love. And you kind of go under this Randolph Stow spell, and then you think you're out of it, and then you hear something like that again, and you're straight back in. Anyway, I'm not quite as beautifully prepared, so I'm just going to sit here and not go up to the lectern. There's a few things that I just scribbled down, and I wondered if I could just ask the people who've been to the grave more recently whether the elderflower is actually still there. Because Suzanne, did you say the elderflower was blooming?
Well, the tree is a beech, which we've just learnt from Genevieve.
Yeah.
But, all around the edge of the field there are giant hedges of elderflower.
Right.
And in the spring, they were just white and green and glorious.
Because
so I took the opportunity to pick a little bunch and put it.
Oh, lovely! Yeah.
Under the tiny little tree, which when I was there was just a stick coming out of a tube, and the tube was there so the rabbits wouldn't get it.
No, it's lovely to see that it's grown like that. And when I was there, which was not long after he died, his neighbour and I went to visit, and we actually planted a little tiny elderflower, but that was probably not what you're supposed to do. You probably just leave the tree there. Anyway, okay. I actually want to start with some words from the man himself, because that's what we're here for. We're here to honour him. And I wanted to quote a little from The Girl Green as Elderflower, because it was from this quote that I got the title for my book. And so here's the quote. "Truly there is in the world nothing so strange, so fathomless as love. Our home is not here, it is in heaven. Our time is not here, it is eternity. We are here as shipwrecked mariners on an island, moving among strangers darkly. Why should we love these shadows, which will be gone at the first light? It is because in exile we grieve for one another. It is because we remember the same home. It is because we remember the same father that there is love in our island." And just reading that now, I just think, what's so powerful about his poetry and obviously his reading is that it sounds like a prayer, and that to me is very similar. And in a sense, in that little passage, there's so many of his themes, isn't there? We're talking about islands and grief and love, and so I just adore that little piece there. I think what's best for me, the best thing I can offer is just a small reading from my book, because obviously all my knowledge and my research is in here. So I'm just going to read from the beginning, which also quotes from a letter from Stow. And then I just wanted to make a few comments about what we've brought up so far, and because he is a mysterious man, and I'm still learning, and I'd really like to hear more from other people today than from me, because I've been blowing on about Stow for a few years now. Okay, so here's my little reading. "One night I dreamt I saw Randolph Stow. He was sitting in a cave wearing a long robe, his chest bare, ascetic like one of the Desert Fathers. There was something magisterial about his aspect and compelling, magnetic. I woke with a shock. This is too much, I thought. This is taking literary obsession too far. Clearly his grip on my mind was burrowing deep. Did I really want to be possessed in that way? Trying to get to know a dead man you've never met and who was notoriously shy and secretive is not easy. Over the last few years I have read and reread Randolph Stow, travelled through Stow country, met with old friends and family who knew Julian Randolph only as Mick, and journeyed far to get to know this most enigmatic of writers. I have collected articles and essays, letters and quotations, and yet I'm still not sure I know this mysterious man any more now than at the outset of this pilgrimage. Maybe that's the way he would have wanted it." Quote from him, "Ideally, perhaps a writer should be totally anonymous, a voice and nothing more," he once said. And yet when I read Stow's work, and especially his poetry, his voice is persistently and intensely personal. Randolph Stow was many things, hugely talented, somewhat tortured, occasionally earnest, and often very funny. His books are full of the haunted and the mysterious, ghosts, second sight, telepathy, mysticism, magic, wild men from the sea, water diviners, green children, apparitions, and talking animals. He creates complete worlds of imagination that are also utterly real. And he does this with the ease of power that one imagines could only belong to some kind of sorcerer or medieval conjurer. Amid the paraphernalia of Stow's artefacts that have gathered around my desk over the years, there is one item of correspondence that proves to me more than any other that Randolph Stow was a magician. It is a letter written to my 6-year-old niece, who's now 22, after reading the largely forgotten classic of Australian children's literature, Midnight, the Story of a Wild Colonial Boy. The beautiful childish handwriting is illustrated with pencil sketches of the animal characters of that book: Red Ned, Dora, Jip, Major and Cat, the talking, scheming, feline accomplice to the dull-witted but always likeable teenage bushranger. So here's the little note from my niece. Dear Mick, I really enjoyed reading Midnight. I think I enjoyed it because of the names of the characters and places. Have you any children? How did you get the idea for the book? And did you get the idea of Mrs. Chiffle from Grandma? I usually ride my bike to school, so just when I get to the paddock, I leave it at my grandma's house. There is a cat next door to her that keeps coming in, but can't talk. Grandma gave me the book to read. Lots of love, Sinead. The fact that Sinead felt she had to confirm to Stow that the cat next door to Grandma's couldn't talk makes me sure that Randolph Stow was a genius. A cat that couldn't talk, thanks to the world as recreated by Stow, was clearly an exception. Stow's postcard in return is typically idiosyncratic. Polite and gracious as always, he carefully ignores all of his young readers' inquiries. Dear Sinead, thank you very much for your letter and for the lovely pictures of the animals in Midnight. I like the smile on the cat. I have a black and white cat who is getting a bit old now. She's 13, but he's as cheeky as when she was a kitten. When the vicar came to see me, she used to sink her claws into his leg, which he didn't like very much. She was a stray kitten, and she picked me up in a pub called the Billy, one hot night when all the doors were open. So her name is Billy. In India, that means she-cat. All good wishes to you and your grandma, Mick Randolph Stow. The young admirer of Stow's work receives none of the information she was seeking. She doesn't find out if the author has children or how he got the idea for Midnight or if Mrs. Chiffle was based on her grandmother. I too see a striking resemblance between Mrs. Chiffle and my mother. Even if I had met Stow, his responses to my own questions would probably have been similar to his responses to my niece, charming, anecdotal and polite, but nothing to do with what I actually asked. And for that reason, this book is not a biography. Neither is it a work of literary analysis or scholarly inquiry. It is more like a mostly private letter, to use Stow's phrase, written out of curiosity and tenderness towards a man whom I have come to think of as an almost relative, a dear friend of my mother's, and the ideal literary mentor. So that's just the opening there. I think while I was reading that, I was thinking, that sort of it's that prayer-like reading that he does, and that he doesn't shy away from religious themes. I think that's really interesting. I think that's one of the things that made him hard to accept in the time that he was publishing here, and particularly what they found difficult to accept, or the literary critics of the time found difficult to accept in Tourmaline. And in a sense, when Suzanne was talking about how he wandered around and it seemed kind of aimless, there's a really beautiful old myth about the monks, the Irish monks of old, of medieval times, who used to actually get in these little boats like kayaks, and they travelled wherever the wind took them, because that's what you do if you're a monk. And he referred to his desk, I think, as like a little monk's desk, and I think he was a bit monkish, and I also think he was a bit of a mystic, and I sort of feel that's one of his difficulties. Is this really kind of amazing contemporary, modern, prophetic writer, but he's also deeply, in some sense, deeply religious and mystical, and but that's also what makes him magic. So I'm just going to, these little things that I scribbled down here, and then I'll finish. I just wanted to say, because Suzanne was talking about biography and the difficulties of biography, and the fact that Stow wasn't keen, and I just wanted to throw in James Joyce's word for the biographer is a biographiend. That's quite cute. And couple of things that I think these are questions, because when you talk about Stow, you often end up with a lot more questions than you end up with statements. And I was interested when I was reading about him that he, I'm going to preface this by saying that of his books, and I love them all, but the ones I really, really deeply, deeply adore are the ones set in Australia. I love Girl Green as Elderflower and the others, but the ones I think that are set in Australia, there's something unbelievable. There's something very special about them. and so it is really mysterious. It's still mysterious to me how he could leave and never come back. Because the one thing that I couldn't ever leave is forever is the smell of the bush, and I kind of felt, how did he leave that smell of the bush behind? And he says somewhere that he had written out his childhood, and that he'd got as much material as he could, and that the landscape wasn't enough material for him that wasn't going to keep him going artistically, and that was one of the main reasons why he left. And I thought that was an interesting comment. Another thing that I've been just really puzzling about for the last few years is actually the last line of the poem that he read, the first poem he read, Wine, where it's really beautiful, and he talks about rejoicing. So the rejoicing, I think, is in the third last line. And then he says, another year, the bubbles rise bitterly in my veins. And I've never quite, what does he mean there? And I've asked Dennis Caskell, and I've asked the authorities, and I haven't, there's this incredible rejoicing, but it's as though, I've got another year to live through. I don't know, Genevieve might have thoughts about these, but these little words that are so powerful, he's put in there. And I suppose that's, one of the things that I want to sort of ask rather than make statements about. And I think that's all I've got to say for the moment. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, and I have to say that I agree with Gabriel that there are far many more questions than there are answers about Stow. I certainly don't propose to give any answers. I just want to talk a little bit about Stow's influence on my life, both as a reader and as a writer. I think in the life of any writer, there's always a handful of the most steadfast companions. To use a very romantic term, they are our literary muses. From my earliest days as a writer, Randolph Stow has been one of them. So I want to talk a little bit now about the profound effect that this extraordinary writer of silences and shipwrecks, of fables and fantasies, of hauntings and dispossessions, has had upon my life, and in particular my writing life. When I was preparing for this talk, I'm from Perth, I went and set up station in the Reed Library at the University of Western Australia, which is my alma mater and also Stow's many years before me. I sat in a study carrel by the window, watching an impromptu game of football on the oval outside with a stack of Stow novels in front of me, thinking of Stow himself sitting here nearly 60 years ago and perhaps looking out at this same view. I don't think it's changed much throughout the decades. In one of those strange synchronicities of the reading and writing life, I was also reading a book of essays by Louise Gluck for another project, and I came across the following paragraph. She's an American poet, in an essay of hers called Disruption, Hesitation, Silence. I just wanted to quote from it because it seemed to speak to me as some of the power and appeal of Stow's work for me and for others too. Louise Gluck, who's writing about poetry, says, I am attracted to ellipsis, to the unsaid, to suggestion, to eloquent, deliberate silence. The unsaid for me exerts great power. Often I wish an entire poem could be made in this vocabulary. It is analogous to the unseen, for example, to the power of ruins, to works of art either damaged or incomplete. Such works inevitably allude to larger contexts. They haunt because they are not whole, though wholeness is implied. Another time, a world in which they were whole, or were to have been whole, is implied. There is no moment in which their first home is felt to be the museum. I always think of Randolph Stow as a writer of silences, hesitations, and disruptions, and perhaps it's for this reason that he speaks so powerfully to me and has shaped so much my own sense of what writing is and can be. Language always straining against silence, the gaps and illusions of human experience and expression just as important as what can be represented. It was Stow who said, if my words have had power to move, forget my words. And then, of course, there's the epigraph from Thornton Wilder in the poetry collection, A Counterfeit Silence. Even speech was for them a debased form of silence. I wasn't thinking about silence and hesitation when I first discovered Stow. I was 14 years old and in my third year at a convent high school in Perth. In the heat of the sweltering summer months, the more bookish students would retreat to the dim shelves of the library at lunchtime. There was a tiny section entitled, written in the copperplate hand of an old nun, Australian Literature. And there I found an old copy of Merry-Go-Round in the Sea and started reading at lunchtime, the book propped up on my knees. I read about a town, shabby, barren, built on shifting sand hills, jutting out into the sea, about the sea gnawing in winter, about tough leaves of trees making a faint clapping, about the deep green ocean and breakwaters, gold and orange, about butcher birds and willy wagtails. I still remember reading the passage about Rob Coram, the young narrator's reflection on his Irish heritage. Rob says, "This meant that in them and in himself there was something foreign and enchanted, something that connected them with the barely credible places where there was snow. He kept the names in his memory as a sort of password to the fatherland, his blood speech." Or this reflection of Rob's, "His country was pretty, but impossibly far from the other more beautiful, soul-filled countries that had earned the right to be written about in books." It seems extraordinary, but in my memory, at 14, The Merry-Go-Round in the Sea was the first Australian novel that I had read. My upbringing and my education had been unashamedly Eurocentric. From a sprawling family transplanted from Europe by way of Africa and full of tales of the cities of England, the spring flowers of Cephalonia, the Jewish shtetls of Eastern Europe, I had inherited the sense that the country I had grown up in was not truly home in a spiritual or even a literal sense, that my family was somehow still in exile in the Antipodes, despite the fact that it was a place that we had definitively stopped. I'd always been a reader, but as a child I had been fed on English staples and German fairy tales. And as a dreamy, romantic teenager, my great heroes were the Brontes, Austen, Dickinson, Shakespeare, and the Russians. I read of moors and Russian country graveyards, of trains sailing through snowy fields, and glamorous European cities, which I marked down in a list of all the far places that I would one day visit. Finally, here was a book about my own land, about the confused spiritual heritage of Europeans in Australia. It spoke so strongly to my own thoughts about my uneasy place in this landscape, and it gave me a way to think about and to seek the meaning of my own country, and my own meaning as a first-generation Australian raised in a family and a culture that looked towards Europe. It was around this time that I began my first hesitant forays into my own writing, and I think of all the things that Stow taught me. I think most importantly about the novel as the most extraordinary liberating of spaces where anything might be explored, anything uttered, anything told. He taught me about the act of writing as the most serious kind of noticing, and of a rescue of things from oblivion, from meaninglessness, from death. He taught me what the meaning of what Walter Benjamin calls the natural prayer of the soul, attentiveness. Other novels taught these things too, but Randolph Stow was from my very own corner of the world. He wrote about our part of the country in the most compelling of ways, and he showed me the way into the great canon of Australian literature, a space that ashamedly I had not yet discovered. He made me think that I could be a writer too, and that more importantly, in my work and in my life, I could forge my own unique Australian sensibility. When I was an undergraduate at the University of WA, initially studying law and then transferring to an arts degree just as Stow did, I was immensely inspired by the fact that he wrote 2 of his novels when he was a student there. The beginnings of my own first novel were planted in that time too, and I think that knowing Stow had written so young was an enormous inspiration for me. As I progressed through all of Stow's novels and his poetry, I found myself drawn naturally to his literary skill, to his poetry of place and his beautiful limning of dispossession and alienation, to his acknowledgement of the inexpressible and the unsayable. I also connected deeply to his sense of restlessness and homelessness. I was reading just recently a beautiful essay by the New Yorker critic James Wood, where he talks about, rather than homelessness, what he calls homelooseness,
It's a kind of neologism in which he says that the ties that bind one to home have been loosened, perhaps happily, perhaps unhappily, perhaps permanently, perhaps only temporarily. This seemed to me to speak perfectly of Stow's sense of his own outsider status, his own unease with his home in the world, his love of the Australian landscape, which he renders so exquisitely, could also coexist with this lifelong sense of restlessness, this kind of nomadic impulse that we've heard about today. Those that know the shape of Stow's life know that he travelled to far-flung places and that his favourite narrative perspective, even when writing about Australia, was the outsider looking in. He always positioned himself as a kind of interloper, geographically, linguistically, spiritually, on perhaps what was his own quest to find an abiding home, both within and without. His literary appropriations of other places, whether the Trobriand Islands of visitants or the Aboriginal mission in the Kimberley that was providing material to the islands, or even among the people of Suffolk, were triumphant. It always amazes me how much he absorbed and reflected of the local ground on which he walked, without ever falling into the dangers of oversimplification or cliché. Possessed what I imagined to be a similar sense of restlessness, of feeling ill at ease in my own land and hungry for different experience, I embarked on my own voyaging when I finished my university studies, moving to Harlem, New York, at the age of 21. At that time, Harlem, which was south of the forbidding Bronx, studded with housing projects which were known as murder cities and bounded by the murky and mysterious East River, was as foreign and as hard to penetrate to me as the Trobriand Islands must have been to Stow so many years before. I wanted to find a way to write about my years in Harlem, which is the project I've now embarked on, my second novel. And when I was doing it, I reread Visitants, in awe of this incredible symphony of voices, of the way that Stow absorbs so much of what he saw and what he noticed and managed to transform it. So now, many years after my time in Harlem and later Mexico, and returned to the Australia that Stow abandoned, I'm at work on my second novel, which is deeply informed by so much of what I first discovered in Stow, the lonely country of the soul, the power and poetry of silence, the transitory nature of whatever love we find in the world, and our perpetual search for home. And I want to end now not with my words, but more appropriately with Stow's. I was given the very difficult and unenviable task of choosing an excerpt from one of Stow's works to read, which had the lovely consequence of making me actually go back and read all of his work again, trying to find the perfect passage. I couldn't find the perfect passage because they're all so beautiful, but I thought that I would read from the beginning of where my love affair with Stow started as a 14-year-old in a Perth high school library, from the merry-go-round in the sea. The merry-go-round had a centre post of cast iron, reddened a little by the salt air, and of a certain ornateness, not striking enough to attract a casual eye, but still to an eye concentrated upon it, to the eye, say, of a lover of the merry-go-round, a child, intriguing in its transitions. The post began as a square pillar, formed rings, continued as a fluted column, suddenly bulged like a diseased tree with an excrescence of iron leaves, narrowed to a peak like the top of a pepper pot, and at last ended very high in the sky with an iron ball. In the bulge where the leaves were was an iron collar. From this iron collar 8 iron stays hung down, supporting the narrow wooden octagonal seat of the merry-go-round, which circled the knees of the centre post, rather after the style of a crinoline. The planks were polished by the bottoms of children, and on every one of the stays was a small, unrusted section where the hands of adults had grasped and pulled to send the merry-go-round spinning. When the merry-go-round was moving, it grated under its collar, but now it was still. There were no children playing about it, only the one small boy who climbed out of the car by the curb and stood studying the merry-go-round from a distance, his hands jammed down inside the waistband of his shorts. Under his sandals, leaves and nuts fallen from the Moreton Bay fig trees crunched and popped. Beyond the merry-go-round was the sea. The colour of the sea should have astounded, but the boy was seldom astounded. It was simply the sea, dark and glowing blue, bisected by seagull grey timbers of the rotten jetty, which dwindled away into the distance until it seemed to come to an end in the flat-topped hills to the north. He did not think about the sea, or about the purple bougainvillea that glowed against it, propped on a sagging shed. These existed only as the familiar backdrop to the merry-go-round. Nevertheless, the colours had entered into him, printing a brilliant memory. Thank you.
I think we're up for a panel discussion and then some questions. And it was put to me to supposedly head this panel, but I feel like I'm the feet and not the head, really, because we've had such tremendously good contributions. One of the phrases that came up for me was a quote from Gandhi, God has no religion. Nobody said that here, but I was thinking about the constant referrals to the silence, to the mysticism, to the ambiguity. And out of this comes really the fact that we're dealing with a writer who had multiple lives. I wondered if we could talk a little about that, how the multiple experiences of Randolph Stow reflect into his books.
Oh, what a question. I think it's true that Stow did have multiple lives. He, not so much a number of lives, but lives on different levels. I mean, he could talk to a 6 or 8 year old child, and a number of people commented that he got on better with their children almost than he did with them. I mean, he had this instinctive understanding of children. The son of the house in New Mexico, in Aztec, he was staying on he rented a cabin from a rancher and his wife, and he said that one of the things that inspired him to write Merry-Go-Round in the Sea, which he started there, was that this little boy, the son, he recognized his relationship with this little boy as the same as his with his cousin Eric Sewell, Rick, in Merry-Go-Round, and this brought back a flood of memories. So that was one level of Stow's being.
And apparently wrote it in 6 weeks, well snowed in. That's the
Exactly, yes, yes.
He actually showed me the board upon which he wrote his books. It was a flat piece of wood with a big clip on the top, and he said that he would think the entire book up from first word to last, and only when he had completed it in his head, he would then give up alcohol, not have no visitors, not even go down to the pub to, talk, and write it all by hand. And that handwritten copy was then sent for somebody else to type to a publisher. You probably heard the same thing.
But
Yes.
and also, I don't know, this is what happens when you get involved with Randolph Stow, and you hear all these rumours, and I've heard this and I've heard that and the other
He
thing.
told me that.
But I know, but it doesn't matter whether
No.
you hear someone saying that. You need to hear it from someone
Or
else.
do you believe the writer anyway?
Yeah, exactly. But the other thing I heard was that he actually had 2 novels like that in his head when he died, that they hadn't gone from here to here.
Yes, he did. There is one argument that staying away from the pub for 3 months was going to be too much of an ask when he no longer had that fierce imperative to write. I think probably more what happened was that there was some sort of accident of psychology that allowed him to suddenly let it all flow out. And he had to be in the right frame of mind. Something magical had to click into being to allow this to happen. And with those last 2 books, although he'd thought them out, somehow it didn't happen, which is sad for us. But just going back to those other as I said, not different personas, but layers. I mean, you had the relationship with a 6-year-old child. You had the highly sophisticated knowledge he had of literature.
Well,
you know,
wasn't he the brain of Britain 3 times or something like that?
he had a phenomenal memory. He'd with his pub friends, who were usually sailors, just local people from Harwich. He was on pub quiz teams, and they would say that you could, I mean, his team were always champions, but they would say you could ask him anything as long as it wasn't about sport or pop songs, popular culture. They used to call him Mick the Book. And if anybody wanted to know anything, they'd go and ask Mick the Book. And if he couldn't give the answer out of his head, he'd go home, he'd look up his books, and he'd come back with a little slip of paper where he had the answer neatly typed out, and he'd give it.
And the facility for languages, we haven't mentioned that, you know.
7 or 8 languages he knew well, and had a sort of a working knowledge of 3 or 4 others. He was absolutely extraordinary. I can only assume he was nearing genius. I do know people who consider that he must have been close to
very
a genius.
close to, yeah.
English heritage, colonialism. Your phrase, I love the homelessness going to homelooseness.
Yeah, it's
And the sense of immigration compared to the sense of exile in Stow, almost some kind of memory of belonging somewhere else.
Yeah, there's a sense in him that he was always kind of seeking for a home and never really finding it. But also a sense that he was at home in so many places in the world, that he could roam from Papua New Guinea to the Kimberleys to everywhere else he went. And I think that's sort of part of, it's very rightly sort of part of the psyche, this sense of roaming the world in search of a home.
And yet an ability to become deeply local. I mean, again, he said that he was very, very pleased that nobody at the pub knew he was a writer.
I don't think that was entirely true.
Well, that was his aim. He'd probably have to change pubs
he
if
liked to think that.
But so it wasn't a sense of exile, was it, in Stow? Do you think, Gabrielle?
Oh, the question of exile and Stow. How many hours have we got?
Yeah.
Because aren't we going to questions?
Perhaps
And
we could.
where's
That's
someone?
Perhaps now it's a good time to see if somebody has a question. Would you like to supervise this, Julia? As to who you...
One question, just put up your hand and we'll bring you a microphone.
The word bitterly. You have trouble with it at the end of wine.
Oh, bitterly. Yes, please explain to me, please.
I'll try.
Go.
Go to the ending of tourmaline. How does that end? This will test you. Come on.
Rachel, help me out here.
We are inheritors of shanties.
That's the beginning, isn't it? Oh, it comes around again.
The
Right.
end. A bitter heritage.
That's it.
But that is not to run it down.
That's right.
You're misinterpreting bitter.
Right. Okay. Good. Well, that's a lovely way to understand it. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter Shanevsky.
Just wait for the microphone.
I suspect that while he's also saying he loves the heritage, he's other of it. Bitterly, he's talked. I am speaking.
I think it's not working
Not on
properly.
Hello. Okay, so I suspect also while he's given us this love. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
He's given this loving embellishment of in the poem. At the end, it's bitter because he can see that it's lovely, but he is other of it. He's distinguishing himself of it. He's not running it down. He's saying that yes, it's lovely, but I am of something else.
Right. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Could you tell us what My question or statement really goes to what you were saying about the difficulty in getting or funding that sort of evaporated. I'm of a very fortunate era, as is my husband, where we actually studied Randolph Stow and Voss and The Tree of Man as a unit of literature at the age of 15 at a public high school. This has evaporated. And it has evaporated at university as well. And there are very few studies in straight Australian lit anymore.
Yes.
And my feeling is that because you have this series of novels which really, not just Stow, but also early Les Murray poetry, Tree of Man and so on, that we have a way of apprehending the landscape that then feeds politically into a situation now where we can shun it and turn our back on it. Because Stow was able to give you that sense of the mystery and ambience and the ability to question our place, which we've now lost because we don't even go back and read those wise words anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Would you call Midnight a kid's book?
No.
I'd call it a book for everyone. There is a story that when Mick gave it to Jock Curl, his editor read it and didn't know what to do with it. So they sent the manuscript to Bill Grono and Janet Grono, who were friends of his in Western Australia. It was read by Bill and Janet to 7-year-olds, to 15-year-olds, and it was read by several 21-year-olds. So Jock Curl still didn't know who to market it to.
They all liked it.
They all liked it.
So did you like it? Oh, good.
Oh, I just wanted to endorse the comment made by the lady who's sitting next to me, because I was very blessed that in the 1960s, when I started an arts degree at Sydney University, they started a School of Australian Literature, and I did my honours thesis on Randolph Stow, and under the supervision of Jerry Wilkes, whose name I saw on one of the brochures there. So all these years later, I can't believe that I was given such a gift, and that I was so blessed, and that students these days don't have that same privilege. So I think that I agree with the lady next to me that should be continued.
One of the things that mystified me really was why he didn't continue writing. You know, I mean, I understand he had a few more books in him, but he didn't actually get them down to get them published. It sort of intrigued me why he was obviously so revered in his time. I mean, he knew he was loved. He won, a lot of awards. I think he understood his place in the literary canon here. And then I read somewhere that it was actually part of his Taoism, that he believed that once you've said it, you don't need to keep on saying it. That he felt he'd said what he needed to say. And I felt that must have been hard, because he must have loved his writing. It seems it seems like it must have been a very difficult thing to have given up when he did it so well.
So it's like a renunciation. He's kind of...
I don't know. I mean, I guess he's sort of... I guess it's tied up in his sort of Taoist philosophy that he just felt, which, I suppose dictated a lot of his way and his retreat and his quietness. And the fact that he'd sort of felt that he'd said it and he didn't need to keep on saying it. Anyway, it wasn't really a question, but
really good.
Love to know what you think.
It's a really good point, isn't it? Why do we demand that somebody keep going? Is it like a long-distance runner who just suddenly stopped to have a glass of water and didn't get back in the race? It's a bit unfair to demand it, isn't it?
What do you think,
Suzanne?
Have you got any thoughts on that?
He did say to several people he thought the trees were too important to waste on books if they weren't important books or words to that effect. On the other hand, he had his much-loved editor, Barley Allison, badgering him, dragging him to London for alcoholic lunches and begging him for a book and writing him letters saying, when are we going to get it? So, yes, he was trying to balance two things, but I think in the end he just thought that the books he had in his head, there wasn't that imperative. It wasn't important.
Yeah, he
enough
lost it wasn't driven. He wasn't
Perhaps
driven.
they would have been brilliant books, you know, because I know from his letters what they would have been about. But he had no hunger for fame. I mean, he'd had fame and recognition when he was 18, 19 years old. He didn't have the sort of ego that demanded to be fed. And he had so many other things he was doing. I mean, he had this life of reading reviews, his friends, cooking from his grandmother's CWA cookbook, all sorts of feeding the swans, communing with his cat.
Walking in the forest.
Walking.
But you didn't ever get a sense that he'd actually lost faith in words and language and the practice itself.
No,
right.
No, because he was reading avariciously. I mean, the scope of his reading in the last 30 years of his life, you know, translation of Chinese, reading in French, almost every aspect of literature in the world, he was going into it more deeply than, you know, most.
And then all that work on the Batavia.
Yes. Extraordinary.
Well, he wrote. He had a theory about what had caused the. The tragedy of the Batavia. He had a theory about what sort of philosophy the murderers were subscribing to and what sort of mindset they had, and that went back to what was
Terentius.
Yes, Terentius.
Dutch artist Terentius.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it's and that meant that he had to learn Old Dutch to research that, and there is an essay, a very, very long essay that he wrote about that, and he tried to get it published, and it seemed too obscure to UWA, was it? I think it was UWA. Or Fremantle Press, or something.
Both.
Yeah, and...
it's too short for a book and too long for
I'm fairly confident that he's going to be published now by Ireland with some kind of contextual essay. And I also heard a rumour that there was a big 8-part series coming to television, a co-production on the Batavia. So if that happens, then that'll raise interest and people maybe might be more interested. I mean, I think people should be interested in the Batavia. I think it's, apart from the being such a dramatic story, there's lots of layers to it. He had some really interesting things to say about it.
Currently not available at all?
No.
It is in manuscript in various libraries.
Yeah, but not to go and buy from anywhere, no.
One of the books he had in his head that he didn't write was called The Opinions of Terentius. And Terentius was this iconoclastic Dutch artist, extraordinary artist, who ran foul of the authorities because of his private life. But he was thought to be the head of the Rosicrucians in... This is all a bit obscure, I could go on for a long time, but I'll try and keep it short. He was thought to be the head of the Rosicrucians in Holland, and the sub-commander, the sub-master of the Batavia, was thought to be a disciple of his. So Mick took it upon himself to learn Old Dutch, go to Holland, find the 17th century 16th century manuscripts that described all these events and Terentius going on trial and being exiled to England, to try and work out what the philosophy was behind the horrendous mutiny and violence on the Batavia before and after the wreck. So this was something that he was doing for years. He couldn't quite make up his mind whether it was going to be a novel or a non-fiction book. So he'd done enough work to write the exhaustive history of this. But again, for reasons we don't entirely know, he never actually wrote it all down.
We've got time for one more question. So, just a hand popping up there. Yep.
Was there did he give any other
Just bring you a microphone.
did he give any hints of the other, or some of the other books that were unwritten? The ones that he didn't get round to write. Were there any others? What was the subject matter?
One was going to be he thought about writing one about the Suffolk poet. I think it was John Clare.
Oh. That would have been beautiful.
There was another poet that he was going to write about as well, and he did a lot of research on that. He felt an identification with those poets because of the area they came from. One was going to be called Our Daffodil. I'm not sure if it was Clare or the other one, because Hazlitt called him Our Daffodil because he was a farmer poet, and when he went to London to mix with the fashionable set, all he had was a pair of green trousers and a yellow jacket, which were highly unfashionable. So the London literati called him Our Daffodil. So that was another one that he didn't write.
Oh, that would have been nice.
Well, speaking of books that are not written, it's probably a perfect place to end.
It is. Thank you.
Yeah.
Before I fully thank all of the panellists, I want to let you know that the featured writer for the honouring series next year will be Henry Handel Richardson. So please join us around this time next year for another engaging discussion. All of the text classic books are for sale in the library bookstore just outside the door, and also books by a number of the authors. So then it just remains, please join me in thanking Suzanne Faulkner, Richard Tipping, Gabrielle Carey and Alice Nelson. Thank you.